This meeting of the Water and Sewer Authority of Cabarrus County to order. Everybody's attendance, and before we get started, thanks to Chad and Thomas for fantastic tour of the health facility. You did a great job, and really good to see it firsthand. It's been a long time since you've done that, so it was a good idea. We appreciate you doing that. Let's move on to we have the first item on the agenda is special. Well, before we do that, we have a new member of our team that has joined us, and Michael, you want to introduce her to the board?
As we told you, Tammy's retirement at the end of December, so we've been interviewing and have selected Shannon Kendall, right? Kendall? King, I'm sorry, King, to be her replacement. She's going to be sitting in with Tammy over the next few months, and Shannon and her getting all the procedures we follow in place. Shannon's been working with the board directors for the Rotary Club for several years, doing their minutes, and has experience on that. She's also worked for Alan Tate,
King Honeycutt,
doing all their administrative duties. So she has a wealth of experience, and we're glad to have her on board. And we're just excited. Excited for Tammy and excited for Shannon. So
I am as well glad to be here.
Welcome. Glad you're part of the team.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll move on. Wendy, you've got an achievement to tell us about.
And it was good timing because our new plaque came in this week, so I can bring it in and show it off. But so this year marks the 26th consecutive year that WSACC has received a certificate of achievement for excellence in financial reporting by the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States, our annual comprehensive financial reports. The certificate of achievement is the highest form of recognition in the area of governmental accounting and financial reporting. So I'd like to thank the finance team that took everybody to produce our book every year and receive the award. So we have lots of places to fill up.
You want to get a picture?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, good deal. Thank you. Great job as always. All right, we have minutes from August 17th. Do we have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve as submitted.
Okay, yes, second. Second, any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. All right, we have new business. Michael, talk about First Amendment to the interlocal water capacity allocation agreement.
okay, this is the amendment we have sent out to all the local jurisdictions for their approval. This is necessary for us to allocate the additional capacity of 1 to 34. 2.1 million gallons will be allocated between the jurisdictions based on methods described in this amendment. And each party is a signature on this agreement. So I think most or all the jurisdictions have signed it. We're waiting on those signature pages to come back and now the final phases for WSACC to approve it, and then we'll be able to allocate that capacity out to the jurisdiction. So ask for your approval.
Any questions or comments about this item?
You said 34, but this is just a 30, right?
I'm sorry, 30. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Thank you. The next thing.
Take it ahead like we all are. All right, any other questions?
Motion to approve.
Motion approved. Got a second? Okay, any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. Okay, move to some reports. Chad, give us a master plan update.
Mr. Chairman, the board is not had here to plan today and for the board meeting. A lot of talk lately has been on capacity, has been on expanding the plant and doing that as quick as we can, and GMPs and everything else. Well, behind the scenes during all this, we've been doing a master plan with Black and Beach to prepare for the future of what's the needs of this community as we continue to grow and as we move into the future. what are the needs of WSAC and our member jurisdictions, water treatment capacity wise to support growth as we move forward into the future and hopefully get and stay ahead of the curve or the wave or however you want to look at it as we move forward into the future, as we know our community is going to continue to grow and so much stuff seems to want to be located here. So I'm going to talk less and turn it over to Black and Beach to talk more about the master plan. We do have a slideshow, 10, 12 slides or so to move through. If he doesn't say it, I'll say it for you. Interrupt me anytime you want. Questions for me, questions for him, questions for Kent. As we move through this, it makes it.
Thanks, Chad. Good evening, everyone. My name is Wilton Osborne. I'm a client director of the project Black and Beach. And with me tonight is Kevin Lapis. He's a planning manager within Black and Beach as well, and he's been supporting on the project. So as Chad said, happy to take any questions as we move through the presentation. All right, so starting from the beginning, the basis of your master plan is looking at population, and then from population comes the demand and flow projections that play into not only your wastewater needs, but also the water needs of Cabarrus County. So, this is a graphic showing essentially, we started with looking at the data that we had, the data that was available. We worked with the member jurisdictions and Charlotte Water to get input. And then as we looked at the data and brought in that input, we looked at current developments. Then we took an even deeper dive and looked into the future land use and suitability analysis. And so this was a really deep dive because we looked at the parcel level to determine what land was undeveloped, what land could be developed, and what would be developed on those parcels. So it was down to that parcel level of analysis. And so from there, once we were understood the development patterns, we were able to develop the demand and ultimately the sewer flow projections. So it was quite an interactive process, not only with the member jurisdictions, but also with Charlotte Water staff, so we could understand all of the flows that would be coming into the county and to the Rocky River facility. And so this is a table of the sewer flow projections. Looking at, we started with what the flows were currently, and actually that base year flow accounts for 2018 through 2021. So we had a basis of which to start. And then we projected it out to 2030, 2040, and then ultimately 2050. And those projections look like by 2050, based on the development patterns that we've seen and from a historic perspective, but also what is forecasted for the future, that by 2050, you'll need about 41 MGD of wastewater treatment capacity. All right, so what does that look like from a needs and timing perspective graphically? So you're under construction currently. Phase 3 will be completed up to 30 MGD. And then around 2027, it appears that from the forecast that you'll need a capacity of 34 MGD. So you'll need to go ahead and move into phase 4, take the facility to 34 MGD. And then phase 5 is somewhere around 2033 to take it to 40 MGD. And then that would provide your capacity out to 2050. Any questions?
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
So we looked at the base year. What year is that?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
That's the actual data from 2022.
Okay, so this is the 2022 data. I mean, it just feels conservative, just off of what we've talked about.
That's the actual flows from 2022.
Right. So how much are we considering any, like, when we get out to 2027 and we're at 34, are we considering any paper capacity or holdbacks or anything in that? Because here we have probably 30%. of our total capacity tied up in paper capacity? If we're at 20 here and we're,
So right now, we have about 12 to 13% of the plant's 26.5 MVD is tied up as developer controlled capacity right now. Okay, so somewhere in that 12, 13, 14% range. And then the remainder is the capacity that the jurisdictions have in hand that could be allocated to projects currently right now. One thing to note here, the 20.9 that we have in year 22 here, going to 29.4 in year 30. Now we have about 1 million gallons of that Red Bull, right? A little over that. So if I took 1.2 million off of the 29.4, and then I looked at the 7 years remaining in this time period, we would need about 420 3-bedroom homes built a month in Cabarrus County to build that. Whereas historically, that number is around 125, 150 is what's actually built in Cabarrus County. So this number is looking at a very extensive increase in the number of homes or commercial industrial users that may take 200,000 gallons at one chunk or 50,000 gallons at one chunk. But it is looking at a pretty steep or significant increase over what we've seen in the number of new home connections. But it should be noted at 2030, that's a 29.4 MGD when the permitted capacity at that point is 34. So you have around that 4.6 MGD of unused capacity. It's also worth noting that historically, the developer controlled capacity number has been around like 1 to 1.5 MGD, and it's currently about 3.2. We would hope that some of the changes jurisdictions have made to encourage projects to happen faster, to, I won't say check out projects, but to kind of pre-qualify projects and hopefully only be kind of processing those projects that are ready to go, you know, that people are wanting to build faster, that 3.2 will come down over time. Obviously, Red Bull's 600,000 in it right now that drives it up some, but we hope that number, or we would assume that number would come down some over time. So even at that 2030 number, there still is a pretty decent gap between available capacity and what we would be forecast to be treating.
so I know, and there's a lot of engineers in the room, a lot of people, you know, deep policy background. I know that we're only treating 21 million, right? And that we have plenty of
Correct.
physical capacity at the plant. But with the latest, 2 million allocation, we're at what, 30?
Third.
And so to my policymakers or my residents or the developers that come in and they say, well, if you got 30 now, why do we have rationing? What's our answer for that? Because when you're going out to 2030, we're saying, well, we don't need any more than we already have.
Yeah, I think the developer control is the answer.
But the biggest thing is stuff's not being built. That historically we've had around 1 to 1.2, 1.3 million gallons of developer control capacity. Now it's at 3.2. Things are being allocated capacity, but they're not being built.
And how much is in the jurisdiction's hands right now?
Before the 2.1, what is it, Thomas?
It's 1.7, something like
Yeah,
that.
1.7. Before the 2.1 that was just allocated. It would be 3.8 after that allocation.
And the remaining 20% is somewhere in the mix somewhere. With 3.2, 3.7,
1.7.
1.7, 3.2.
That's about 5. That's about 5 MGD. So that's 26.
It's
So
about 26. So we
yeah,
about 4 million.
Charlotte Water's the remainder of
Charlotte
that,
Water.
what they have that is allocated to them.
And does that remain consistent throughout the years? The Charlotte Water amount off the top.
Well, they have 9. They'll have 9 MGD.
So in that 40, 9 of that goes to that 41 in 2050.
Well, at 40/50, if they're 9.16, they will have had to have purchased more capacity at that point. They would have to have their 10 or 12 or whatever they purchased at that point. They have their contractually are obligated, or they have the contractual ability to purchase up to 12.
And they purchased
No,
9 now. But so the 9 is built into
correct.
these numbers. I'm good for now.
Might not be bad to have Chad, you send a summary out of what we just talked about. I think that elevator speech Rob's talking about is a good thing to simply describe.
Yeah.
Sort of the difference between where we are and our capacity, where that phantom capacity is, we know where it is, but
Right, and that's what we tried, to try to clarify that a little bit, to start at that, is changing that terminology instead of flow accepted, but not yet connected to developer control
yeah,
capacity, to kind of try to drive that home. That is capacity that they control at that point, and it's a huge number.
Yeah.
It's a huge number. But yes, we can put something together.
something really, just a one pager to explain that would be good to almost to have.
All right, so I'm gonna switch from wastewater needs to water supply needs. Okay, so looking, using those same projections and development. We projected water demands within the county out to 2050. And so we looked at we did detailed surveys of the existing reservoirs to determine safe yield. And so to explain this figure, permitting for water supply is based on the drought of record, the 50-year drought of record. And so you look at what the safe yield of your water sources are during that drought of record, the 50-year drought of record. Okay, so the 50-year safe yield is the heavy green line, just above the 40 MGD. And so the lighter shade below is the 50-year operational yield. So I want to explain the difference between the 50-year safe yield and the 50-year operational yield. Okay, so right now there are some restrictions in your water supply that do not allow you to get to the full 50-year safe yield. And those include primarily, and I have a slide coming up that'll explain a little bit better, but so right now you're only taking 5 MGD of the Yadkin River interbasin transfer, and then you're taking none of the 10 MGD of the Catawba River transfer, and that makes up the biggest delta here. Okay, and so that's why there's a gap. All right. So the good news is, if you're looking at this figure, the lighter blue line, the low inflow protocol demand is your average annual demand reduced by 50 or 15%. And the reason for that is during a drought, you're required to reduce water usage. And so by reducing your water usage by 15% during a drought, especially if you're in the 50-year drought of record, the good news is that if you implement some of the fixes that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, you're actually below your 50-year safe yield all the way out to 2050. So with those improvements that I'll get to in just a minute, you will have enough water, based on the projections out to 2050. Okay, everyone understand that?
But does that require taking the Yadkin River and the
Yes, sir, it
it
does.
requires us to take both of those?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
It does. And the good news from that perspective is that the heavy permitting effort has already been completed once the interbasin transfer certificates were issued. Right, so you don't have to go through that again. You put in the infrastructure, and it's a normal design and construction project.
But we don't have infrastructure to get to that level, do we?
Well,
On the Atkins side?
on the Atkins side, you almost do.
Yeah.
There's some discussions and work underway the pipeline is in place.
Yeah.
From Albemarle to Cary, actually, 15, 17 MGD. So the pipeline has enough capacity to carry more than 10 MGD to account for peak periods and things like that coming from the Yadkin.
I was thinking more about the Catawba. We don't
Catawba?
have enough
No.
infrastructure to get that
No,
level of Catawba, do we?
no, there's not. So, Black and Beach is actually doing the water distribution master plan for Charlotte Water. And this will be something that'll be discussed as part of that project. Okay, how to get water from the Catawba over to Cabarrus County. Okay, and I can come back to this slide. The next couple of slides are talk about things in a little bit different manner. So from a regulatory perspective, when your average annual demand passes your 50-year or 80% of your 50-year safe yield, which 80% is represented by the dashed line, you need to begin planning for identifying additional water supply sources. So that, by the projections, that's approximately 2029 when that planning needs to begin. And then you need to have additional resources available in place by about 2042 because your average demand will exceed your actual 50-year safe yield of your current supplies. Okay, so those are a couple of milestones that need to be planned for to begin that planning for additional water supply, and then have some additional supply in place by 2042. Okay. All right. Same graphic. And if you build up from the solid operational yield, and then the next layer of information is the additional interbasin transfer from the Catawba. Okay. And then the orange line is the additional transfer from the Yadkin. And then that gets you to having enough water supply to fulfill your 50-year safe yield needs. Okay. And so what happens after 2050? So there are some options. Okay. There is a pipeline and that comes from Salisbury, Rowan that's in place. I think it can carry about 11 MGD when it was designed. It's no longer in service. It's being used to transfer water to some other small communities between Kannapolis and Salisbury, but that is a potential source. The one caveat to that is it would require a modification to the interbasin transfer certificate. There has been discussion in the House or in the state legislature about modifying the interbasin transfer rules. And so if that were to happen, especially as it was written, that would eliminate the sub-basin transfer component of the interbasin transfer statute, which would make pulling water from the Yadkin River much easier. And for those that were part of that interbasin transfer process, it's hard to forget, but the difficulty of that interbasin transfer was really from the Catawba side. And so whether or not you use the Salisbury Rowan resource or look for another, increase your water supply from Albemarle, or drop another intake in on the Yadkin, we feel that would be the much easier approach than trying to get more water out of the Catawba. So there are some options that need to be considered as planning progresses and as you get into the upcoming years for water supply planning.
But no guarantee that the communities along the Yadkin would feel the same way the communities felt along the Catawba when we were talking about.
Right. there's no guarantee of that, but, you know, based on what transpired back in 2007, there was, very limited objections to going to the Catawba. Or, I'm sorry, going to the
What you
Yankton,
said,
my
the
fault.
legislation. You removed the sub-basin issue, then
Yeah, right.
it really couldn't be, then would eliminate the ability to object on a sentence.
Yeah, and was that 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Jeff, myself went to Raleigh for a meeting with Senator Newton and DEQ and others to discuss that. And the discussion right now is that we're gonna try to proceed with declassifying the Rocky River Basin, just singly Rocky River Basin as a sub-basin, just making it part of the Yadkin. There seemed to be support of that and an understanding that there's 38 sub-basins out there and some of them really don't make sense. And DEQ admitted that during that. Whether we get that win or not is to be seen. But obviously that would be a huge win for our community if Rocky River was just folded into the Yadkin and then that was removed as a challenge for getting water. So that's kind of what Jeff and myself kind of feel like's the most likely path to try to support and move forward here with regulation early next year.
That would be a huge win. Okay, any question on water supply?
When it comes to the, you mentioned the Catawba, 10 MGD, and we said we don't have infrastructure in place. I know it's been cost prohibitive to this point, but does Kannapolis have an interconnect with Charlotte water?
We
You
don't.
do, and we do.
Yeah, we've got 5.
We've got 2, you've got 5. Other.
We could easily have one, but not for that amount.
Right.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking of the summer. So I mean, if we have 7,
If we had a temporary.
yeah, I'm wondering, because we're in discussions on the south side of the tracks in Harrisburg on how much flow could they get to us, knowing that we have, this reservation in the IBT now, and the Concord's, the throughput for all of our stuff out of Cottle Creek, anything that we take on the south end leaves volume on the north end. So do you know that? Do you know the volumes that we can get through those 7?
So I had a conversation with Charlotte Water and their planning group. And they felt that that they could only reasonably transfer 3 comfortably, something like that, into Bears County.
And Mike, that number drops to 7, right? That Catawba number drops to 7
Yes,
in drought conditions.
during drought conditions, that's correct. That's correct. You would be expected to follow the Catawba LIP protocol.
But I think assuming all the hydraulics work countywide, I mean, maximizing Yadkin is clearly the right play. Especially if we get relief on the interbasin transfers, even without it though, I mean, I'm not sure an interbasin transfer process there, I'm in that camp that I think won't be easy, but it'll be tolerable. If we get to that point, that we don't have legislation to help. So.
Yeah, I think at the minimum, we're gonna be able to get some legislation where if you're pulling from a sub-basin, that the water's returning to that major river basin, that is a much more streamlined process. They're really focused, and most of the opponents statewide are from major river basin to major river basin transfers. Not so much if you're just bypassing some communities, let's say. That could be an issue, obviously, but it's not to the same level as if you're changing major river basins. So I think they're looking at there having to be less public meetings, quicker reduced review times required by the state, a little bit less of environmental studies that have to be done. And so your hope would be that it would take a year or 2, not 5 to 7 years,
We will all want to age 10 years by doing it.
All right, so I'm gonna switch gears again to the NPDES permit. increase in that process. All right, right now, Rocky River has an NPDES permit of 34 MGD. And so the process to increase your NPDES permit is somewhat of a lengthy regulatory process. And so one of the complicating or I guess challenging issues that had to be addressed on the Rocky is that there's a number of wastewater treatment plants along the entire stretch of the river, 90 miles. Okay, from where it ties into the Yadkin all the way up into the basin to Mooresville. Okay, and so with the number of other communities that are discharging into the Rocky, the state requested or required that that there needed to be a complete model done for the whole river so they could make an assessment of the impacts, not only of WSAC's discharge and future discharges, but also how do you, what the impact is when you combine the other discharges. So for example, Charlotte's Mallard Creek wastewater treatment plant is looking to increase their NPDES permit. And so the state told us either you opt and develop this model or we can do it, but if we do it, it's probably going to be decades before you get an answer. They just don't have the staff. Right. So anyway, so we proceeded with the modeling. All right. So the modeling is used to determine the environmental impacts, how the waste stream is assimilated into the Rocky River, and if there's any impacts to the water quality of the stream. And so the goal of the modeling is to be able to take that model and input speculative draft speculative limits that are more favorable to WSAC and present those to the state for approval versus just asking them, what do you want the limits to be? We're going, the methodology that we're using is we're going in with data and fact so that we have a negotiating position with the state to be able to say, this is what's reasonable. There's no impact on the stream. We would like these speculative limits so that we can get reasonable speculative limits. Okay. All right.
Are you guys modeling the entire 90 miles
Yes.
on our behalf? Only our behalf, or
We worked out with Charlotte Water and with Mooresville. They were trying to work through all of that, but they have both verbally agreed that what was the dollar amounts?
It was almost 400,000.
Yeah,
So
so probably half the cost of the modeling effort, Mooresville and Charlotte Water is contributing to. So it was not only on our dime.
how many other discharges are there?
There was what we looked at, yeah, we all looked at the others were pretty small. So we looked at like the total discharge limits. You have Mallard Creek is pretty big. The Rocky River plant in Mooresville is pretty big. We're big. The others were, Oakboro and, Union counties is pretty small. And it was almost one of those, if you went to somebody and said, can you contribute $20,000, it's almost like the effort to try to get that money was not worth it.
Just want to make sure we got those other partners.
Yes,
working. So-
yes, and they were very willing to.
Oh, right,
Yeah,
right.
they see value in it too, because it not only gets you the right limit, I won't say the most conservative, it gets you the right limit, but it also gets quicker for you than them having.
Well,
to
the state will be more responsive if we're all in the same boat.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. Yes. And they're, like Ted said, they were willing participants. So, all right. So to give you some background about the modeling effort, we developed a plan that how we were going to approach the development of the model, what parameters we would test for, and DWR approved that some time ago. And then we developed a model for the entire 95 miles. And part of that was doing extensive field testing, which incorporated dye testing. There was cross-section measurements to understand the flow characteristics and the stream morphology, and temperature measurements, DO measurements, all up and down the 95 miles. And there were, it wasn't just there was multiple days of going back to the same location to get different measurements just during the sampling period, so that the model could be fully calibrated and be able to predict on a more accurate basis. So the modeling report was submitted to DWR in June. Unfortunately, they received like 3 or 4 other modeling reports simultaneously. We did receive comments though on September 18th, and we have a follow-up call with DWR on October 3rd to go through their comments and get them, make sure that we understand them so we can update the report and move on with the modeling. And so from there, once they approve the modeling report, that's when we start inputting proposed speculative limits for the next NPDES permit and see what makes sense, see what the impacts are within the model, and then we'll be able to go back and make that speculative limits request.
So do you have kind of a timeline on that? I mean, if it took from June to September to get comments, and I'm kind of curious what the comments were. Were they?
So
Was it process or?
there was I don't remember all of the exact wording of the comments, but they're questioning some of the DO, how that related to the actual field measurements. And so we're working with a couple of sub-consultants on this. One of them, this is really all that they do is the stream modeling. And the other, both that sub-consultant and the other sub-consultant are former DWR employees. In fact, one of them wrote the rules 30 years ago. And so the feedback that I'm getting from them is just confidence that let's just get on the phone, let's explain and have a discussion, and we should be able to move forward and put it behind us. Okay. All right. So so there have been a number of activities that have been going on in parallel. So where we are right now is looking at the capital improvement planning, taking the information for the projections and looking at where the growth patterns are within the county and how that impacts your infrastructure. And so this is a preliminary snapshot of the infrastructure needs. So there's 20 conveyance projects, pipeline projects, and pump station related projects. There's 9 condition related projects, and then there's 7 treatment related projects. And so again, this is we're still hot and heavy in the midst of finalizing the projects, getting the write-ups done. But part of the deliverable to WSACC will be a dashboard similar to what's shown on the screen. And so what this depicts is the project BC-01. On the left-hand side, it says total cost is 10.3 million, and it breaks it down into planning and engineering and then construction costs. And then in the center portion, it shows the project duration, when it's anticipated to start based on the projections. You know, so in this instance, it's 2024 to 2027. There'll be 2 years of planning anticipated, 2 years of construction. Below that, it describes the project benefit of doing the project. And in this case, it's to provide adequate capacity for expected growth. And then below that, it illustrates and describes the project trigger. So, and this is important for projects that are in future years as well, in particular, so that WSACC will be able to monitor flow within their system. And when, for example, when flow hits a certain threshold, then they know that it's going to trigger this a project that it needs to be initiated and start the planning process and design and then get into construction so that it's in place as those flows go up. And that's just an example. There's other triggers, and each project has its own specific trigger. Okay. And then on the right-hand side is a more detailed project description. So in this case, the Back Creek Trunk Sewer, it serves Harrisburg. And there's in the future, it's anticipated it'll carry flow from Charlotte Water and Mecklenburg County to WSACC. And so it gives a more detailed description of the project and a graphic of where the project is located. And like I said, all the projects will have their own project page within the dashboard to facilitate maintenance of the CIP. And this can be easily updated, in the next cycle of master planning. So it's a living document. And then this is the overall dashboard look. The previous page, you can dive into each project. This gives you an overall snapshot of what the master plan is showing. And I want to emphasize that this is still preliminary. We're making some final adjustments. And so it shows you the overall volume of CIP projects, roughly 768 million. That encompasses 36 projects. And that's over the 50-year life cycle or the lifespan of the planning period. And then down below, you can see the forecast for when the projects are anticipated to be programmed. And what you can use this for is you can look at cash flow and determine, okay, really our budget limits us to X amount. So we need to defer some of these projects and allow you to balance the cash flow if you need to move things up, move things back. So that you have you can see the whole picture and not make a decision based on just one project, is my point. All right, so we're still working. Most importantly, working on the final master plan and the recommended project descriptions. We are working on the dashboard summaries for the CIP projects, the system flow monitoring and tracking, as well as the pending development. We've had a number of conference calls to make sure we're all on the same page as to what functionality those dashboards will have. And so that's a work in progress, and we'll get examples over to Thomas to take a look at and continue giving us feedback. And then the next critical thing that we talked about previously was getting approval from TWR on the modeling report. And then we'll be working on issuing the request for speculative limits for the next stage of the NPDS permit expansion. So just to note, getting speculative limits is a very important milestone. It allows you to continue the permitting and regulatory work, which includes an engineering alternatives analysis, potentially an environmental assessment for the expanded facility. And once the EAA, engineering alternatives analysis, and environmental assessment are complete, then you're allowed to officially request an expansion of your NPDS permit. So it's a process, and there's specific steps that have to be followed, or you can make that official request to get an expanded NPDS permit.
Would your model be able to tell us that, okay, we can't handle too much more load here in this region where Rocky River is, but if we build a different plant upstream someplace where we might be able to put more load in, will your model tell us all of those choices as to where we might build in the future?
Yes. And that would be the same as another community using the same model. So that, you know, that's what the model will allow us to look at is, for example, and I don't believe this to be the case. I don't have the full answer right at this moment, but if we were to look and say, okay, the current discharge location for the Rocky River has a cap of 40. Okay, let's just say 40. Okay, which then we could go down further downstream or somewhere upstream and put an imaginary discharge in there and see what the impact is to the water quality. So in a river system, what's called, we're really looking at essentially a WSACC curve. So when you discharge wastewater into a moving stream, the DO drops. And then as it re-aerates, as it moves downstream, it re-stabilizes itself. My instinct, based on what knowledge that I have today, is that there's plenty of flow going down the river right here. And really it's a function of how much flow that you have in the river. My instinct is that it shouldn't be a problem.
But that's another reason we saw the value in going ahead and doing the model,
Mhm.
not only helping us from this one permit, but helping us future permits. And that's the value Charlotte Water and Mooresville saw that as well, because they're gonna need it as well.
So does it help us revisit those speculative limits at Muddy Creek?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
That's correct.
Hey, any questions for Mike, for Chad? Any other discussion?
I guess just one comment. Earlier, you came out all the data and the interaction from the different communities, and you built this big database. Of course, on the allocation side, we have all this new data where 100 units are allocated here, and now 100 of them have built, so on. I guess that ultimately out of this plan becomes a larger living database that we keep up with, because
And we've been talking with,
keep talking about the schools.
yeah, we've been talking with the schools, they've been involved, and so, yes. We're trying to create a working document that works well for
Because, I
them.
mean, what you put together for this is so valuable, not just for this master plan, but everything else.
Right.
Down in the community.
Right. I don't know that we've given it an official name, the dashboard.
No, we need something catchy.
We're a bunch of engineers, we don't. try to get you down.
Master plan take into account, anything other than capital improvement, for instance, policy or legislative changes, the sewer side of things, so like developer control. Put us putting limits at WSACC on how long they have for that before it expires, the debt free up a certain amount. And what I assume CIP investments go up to greater than the 40. What I missed that in the
Correct. It took us to I believe it had the expansion to 40 on it from a treatment plant standpoint.
Right.
And then I think there was some design work later on for above 40.
So the capital takes up that 40 to 2050. But I guess is there a gap in there? I feel like we're gonna need more than 40 if we continue the same practice that we have now. I mean, I don't know what you have in Concord on backlogged projects that have been denied capacity, but we're at like 700,000. I'm not sure what Kannapolis is, but I don't think those are in this. So it's like if we continue to send people through and then with that new backlog, I imagine it's going to stay up there in that 12%.
It could, and it gets to a point of that we all recognize when you have a planning document that's looking out 15 years or more beyond that, there's so many unknowns that it's hard.
The plan was 400 versus 100.
Yeah, so
There's a buffer built in already.
correct. So for example, the last 20 years, Cabarrus County's grown roughly somewhere in the 6 to 7 MGD range in the last 20 years. So even if you doubled that, that puts us at like 33, 34 MGD, 35 MGD. You know what I mean? So like that's why you don't do one master plan and don't ever look at it again. 10 years or so, or I mean, we have the data every year, but it will be looked at again. But it's hard to pin down now that you're gonna need to expand your plan again in 2044. You know,
If you go back to that first slide that we were at, I think 34 got us to
you have the
29,
worst part, correct?
23. Then when would we anticipate, we'll move to 34, at that point, we lift restrictions? We go back to applications coming directly to WSAC instead of community controlled and.
I'm not
stay
sure
on
we're
that.
ever going back.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna.
But I think that, I mean, from a master planning standpoint, we have to plan.
Yeah.
To, if we. To not have restrictions.
And I think to your
I think
point,
practically
right, so
you're
we've got
right.
all these projects that we're ready to go that we've all denied, and that's getting to be a really large number.
Yeah.
And if we had the flow, right, if we went back to first come, first served, those are gonna instantly gobble up,
All
Hey, right, you're gonna make a huge jump, like all at one time.
Yeah, we're,
I think the
Yeah,
question is, we're creating this master plan to direct the growth.
Yeah.
Right, so are you directing the growth, or I don't know, I don't ever see that going back first come,
free
first
for all
served.
where it's
Right.
first come, first
But,
served.
but I think if we, so if that is, that's how we're gonna treat it, that's okay. But I think we need to communicate that out as a group to say, you know, we're gonna limit our, but we're not gonna build excess capacity. We're not gonna have a sewer capacity here. We're not planning for it on the master plan. We're gonna ration it out to growth as we can, or what's the limit? Is it financial? Is it permitting? I think that's, when you do a master plan, generally you go and say, okay, I know I'm gonna need X amount, let me do X amount plus 10%, so I've covered it and I'm not gonna have any future capacity issues. And if the permitting issue is that, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the bottom line is we have to look at historical growth and understand where we've been. Or we're just guessing. I mean, we're just, we can build 100 million gallons a day if the Rocky River would take it, but how can we afford that if the growth really isn't responsive?
Yeah, and when you look at building 10 MGD is $400 million, there is a financial component that you have to.
Well, and that could be fine, like, we could communicate that out, say, hey, it's $400 million, we're not gonna do it. Unless the state steps in and gives us $400 million. But I think if we as a group say, hey, we're planning to go to 35.5 in 2040, and that's good. We're seeing it, and we're expanding to 34 now. I feel like I'm being disingenuous if I say it.
I feel like you're saying the plan doesn't take into consideration all the pent-up demand. Is that?
The pent-up demand, the paper demand, the ability to issue a permit. I mean, at the end of the day, I think when an Eli Lilly or anybody else comes in, they just want to, can I hook up to the sewer? I don't care what your number is in your project. Can I hook up? And if Eli Lilly too wants to come in and stop there, I say no. I go, why? And I have no idea. It says we have enough.
But they work with all the planners in the jurisdictions and they should have been bringing that information to mind.
Right.
If there's a disconnect.
Well, to me, I think the disconnect is the 20.9 versus the 28.5 that already, at 28.5, I feel like we are already rationing. When we know we can physically treat 26 and a half. I'm excluding the other two. But we can physically treat 26 and a half. And we're starting at 20.9. So I know that I have another 5.5 million in problems. They may not be capital. We don't necessarily solve it with building a bigger plant. It may be legislative, it may be administrative solutions to free up that 5.5. But I think we're disingenuous if we don't say, well, that 5.5, it's temporary. That's going to be solved in the future, and we don't know what that solution is. That's my concern. If that makes any sense. If those numbers are benchmarked to each other, the 21, say 21 in our base year, We know that's not enough for what we're doing right now. So 35 in 2040, if we're benchmarking everything consistent, that's not enough in 2040. It's gonna be 5.5 million load, we're in the exact same spot we are now in 2040 with that number. With all the sinker. Not counting the penalty.
Other thoughts?
I do think we appreciate the discussion on safe yields and water because we talk so much about sewer allocation. We don't talk enough about water supply. And I know some of this is, we're looking at these treatment, there's some portion of that which is actually coming from Catawba right now and is part of Charlotte Waters, IBT. But that said, you know, everyone's concentrating on sewer and we sometimes overlook water. Fortunately, the communities don't overlook water. Kannapolis and Concord in particular, the original IBT, no matter what the pain, really was important that that happened.
Well, and we recognize that we're in year 5 of 5. Above, all 5 years being above average, with 2 being very much above average. And that's going to invert at some point to where we run through a period of drier weather. Hopefully it's not a drought. Hopefully it's not as extreme as the 2 wet years that we've had. But at some point that will normalize to a more normal, hopefully maybe slightly below normal type of a pattern, not a drought. But at that point, wastewater capacity maybe doesn't become as big of an issue and water capacity becomes a bigger issue. And we just want to make sure we had the data and was prepared for that and not surprised by anything from that. Because, you know, as recently as the 2018, our flow was 17 MGD from a wastewater standpoint. And I still believe that 1 million to 2 million gallons a day of our annual average flow right now is I&I. And during an extremely dry period, we would see that flow, wastewater flow drop, and as that drops, that's capacity that's available. Now that could reverse, then we get back into a wet period. And I think we all see our weather patterns turning much more cyclical than they've ever been, or more extreme than they've been. And I think that'll continue, but we wanted to be not surprised on the water side.
Yeah, no, I think water is a much bigger emergency when you start running into that.
Yes.
And then people flush their toilet, it's going somewhere, whether we like it or not, it's
Yes.
coming to the plant. You turn on the faucet, it doesn't work. Mike and I leave town. We don't want those phone calls.
Well, I think there was a good discussion. I think having Chad that little major might help us and all sort of keep focused on the bigger picture of what these dynamics really are. You know, for the elevator speeches for elected officials and others.
Right, and I think we can try to continue to communicate the 2 big unknowns that we've experienced in the last 5 years is the rainfall and the increase in developer control capacity going from around the 1 to 1.2, 1.3 MGD to over 3 MGD. That those 2 unknowns or unpredictable facts happening have really contributed to this, because when they compound, when they stack on top of each other, that's all of a sudden a 3 and 4 MGD impact.
Yeah, and I agree, those are the reasons we're here, but they may be the new norm.
But I will say our policy, and it's not a WSACC, our policy is that there's a specific time frame. They have to, you know, get permits and break ground by a certain time or they lose their capacity. So.
I mean, we're doing that too, but that expires in 15 months.
Yeah, right.
So then it's back to WSACC unless we all
Extend it.
and extend it.
Yeah, which we may. I mean, that may be the decision this board says is that we're going to continue to allocate it that way.
And I think the big question, Chad, comes down to, and it's real simple. It's like, okay, when are we solving the problem? And I think the answer to that is we're not. We're planning, we're expanding as much as we can. And if everything aligns, we may have enough for everybody, but we're gonna ration it for the, foreseeable future.
Yeah, I guess we ought to probably also stop calling it a problem. It's the new norm.
I think you ought to stop calling it rationing.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the norm.
That's a punitive term.
It's
Excuse me. It's just.
Well, I think part of the narrative too is understanding where all that capacity we lived off of for a really long time, why it was there. Right? Because we would have been in this 15 years ago, had we.
We're getting ready to expand the plant in 2000.
Well,
And within
Right.
6 months.
well, Pillsbury closure gave us
Billions and
about,
billions.
yeah, you know, about 10, 12, 13 years of freebies. That just was, hey, forget it. We pushed this off and we all pushed it off.
Sure. And I'm happy to call it, selective allocation or what, trying to go to one term, but, people are gonna say, what is the selective allocation? And, let's say it's not. And then the ultimate question comes back, okay, well, what do you need?
But I think that is a policy decision this board and ultimately jurisdictions have to make, that it is the new norm or it's not. Because we go back to a free-for-all of first come, first served, I think that's a mistake.
And it is a problem that money can solve,
Yeah.
we can spend our way out of what you're talking about, but then you have to consider the impacts that has to existing customers.
Well, I think one of the things that we need to stop saying is this master plan is solving a problem. It's actually not solving a problem, it's creating the roadmap for how we want to go to the future.
Planning the future.
And so again, I think it's also the terminology and the expectation of the plan.
And I think we need to recognize, because the master plan gives us a graph that says we need to expand in 2034. That doesn't mean we have to wait to 2034 to expand. It's just saying we have to expand by that point. That doesn't mean we can't in 2031 or 2029. It just means by this point in time, per the projections, we have to expand at this point. And it's that guidance document to give you that and that roadmap kind of to the future.
So that's a great point. What is the goal? Goal to have unrestricted access to utilities and let the growth be controlled by the.
That's what it was policy until about 3 years ago for all of us.
Because I think that's I think a lot of communities want that to be. They want to control their own growth, not be stunted by external factors. And most of the business community that calls all of our legislatures and the legislatures call us are saying the same thing. If we can't do it, that's great. We just need to identify to them why we can't. And say, look, it's 400 million. The state wants to step in and waive regulations and build a new plant for us. We'll operate it and treat the sewage. We're good at that. But our existing customers aren't willing to pay $300 a month for other people's future capacities. And I think it's a very reasonable approach to take, but I guess I wouldn't assume that for the business or the legislative community.
Well, and what is the development community willing to do? And what's the tipping point when we make them pay part versus when they say we're going elsewhere? So always these balances.
Well, I think we have to remember, this is also a silo of we've got the schools, we've got growth does not just impact sewer. So I think that we have to remind our developers or the individual that's on the receiving end of the conversation of it's not just about the sewer or the water, it's about the schools, it's about road infrastructure. So we've got to work alongside all of those entities. So
oddly enough, this is the only group in the entire county that has any influence over that as a body. That influences everybody. So I'm not putting pressure on them. It's true.
I would say there was a time in the 90s, even when there was this discussion that water lines be run throughout the county, that you'd start to provide sewer services throughout the county. 50% of the county is unsewered and doesn't have public water. And now you don't really hear that clamoring anymore. Now I think as you start to, that supply continues to dwindle of raw land, there's going to be a push to start to put sewer in other basins. Aren't now, and that's where this master plan comes in and say, well, that has a real consequence. It's all these other services, it's got this cost, there might not be capacity. This kind of helps with that larger discussion, although again, I'm not sure there's going to be that same kind of push. And a lot of areas are happy that they don't have public sewer service.
In a weird way, it's kind of worked out. Something we've been talking about for decades.
Yeah.
Is now the norm now. All right, any other discussion? I think this is not the end of this, obviously. We're going to keep talking about this up until and after the master plan's approved and adopted. Good discussion, Mike. Thanks for your time. Yeah.
Thank you all.
All right, any public comments from anybody in the audience? Anyone?
Make one.
Yes, indeed.
Just want to mention the state budget, and the state debt we got. Had some questions about whether we're going to use this money to buy down the debt for the expansion. We will come back with some formal recommendations on which projects we think this money should go to, once we get more information on how the money's coming, whether it's ARPA money or infrastructure money or state money. But our opinion is we would go ahead and issue the regular amount for the revenue bonds, about 100 million. We feel like if we use this money for buy down the debt, we will have to go through a number of different procedures with the state to get approvals and then delay the project. Since this project is so time sensitive, we feel like that money can best use for lines and other things that is time critical. So that's, we will come back with some recommendations.
Rates also 5% below prime, which we can get in the near future, so I would not buy that.
$700 million worth of projects.
Yeah, they're-
I don't have a problem finding what's
Plenty of projects.
Right, and there's some short term or, projects here in the next 5 years or so that are scheduled in the next 5 years are gonna need, it's gonna need that money.
But
So,
part of that is earmarked for Midland.
Well, there's two different stories right now, but right now 11 million is that's for Muddy Creek, not Midland, but Muddy Creek.
Is that how the final,
Well, we don't know yet. Today we
at
saw.
one point it had it split.
Today, we saw a new one where it split 5 million for the plant, and 6 million for lines, the other way around.
If it was today, that's the one that got it out.
Okay,
no, I think before it went final vote, it got changed back.
we've seen the number of costs today on that.
You get a budget today.
Midland wanted it back into the one pot of money is what we understand.
Okay, so they wanted it in the Muddy Creek.
Yes.
Okay.
Another thing real quick on that, you might be hearing some of this from staff because it's one of those technicalities from when Senate Bill 693 got approved. There was some cleanup of the wordage when they ran that through on the 75 gallons per day per bedroom. We had that written spelled out specifically that one bedroom would be counted as one bedroom. They wrote it saying that it's 75 gallons per bedroom, and they made the assumption that that meant that one bedroom was 75 gallons per day. And they took the language out that one bedroom would be counted as one bedroom. DEQ is now reading that as then that doesn't override the 2-bedroom minimum that is required by 2T regulations. Part of this budget is and I don't understand how all this works, but is a correction, a wording correction to a bill through the House that's going to deal with that. It's supposed to correct that. Obviously, from what I understood that this budget's going to get passed, it's going to get vetoed by the governor. It's going to have to go back and be, override the veto. So it's probably going to be mid-October. So what your staff may see over the next month, if we submit projects with one bedroom in there, they're going to have to be counted as 2 bedrooms at 75 gallons per day per bedroom. We'll be able to correct that if that gets done at the end of the year. So it'll just be a annoying exercise for Thomas Hahn and for y'all staff in the short term on that. I didn't want you to hear that from your staff and wonder what's going on. But Senator Newton and his staff and others are aware of it, and everybody from DQ and Raleigh, everybody understands that was the intent. But now their policy weeds are saying, but that's not what it says. And was one of those from what final draft of what got approved, somebody said, well, this will sound better, and it kind of messed us up. So
Thanks, DEQ.
Okay. All right, anything else from staff? Okay, got a closed session. Do I hear a motion to go into closed session under GS 143-318-11A3 and A5?
no move.
Motion, second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We stand in closed session. Got a second? Any discussion on favor? Any opposed? We are adjourned. Quick comments.